right, let's get comfortable, shall we? Perhaps pour yourself something nice. Because the story we're about to unravel isn't just a simple biography. It's a sweeping, century-spanning epic packed with forbidden love, aristocratic rebellion, breathtaking creativity, and a level of scandal that would make modern tabloids blush. We're delving into the life of a woman who was a paradox wrapped in Chanel, a poet who wielded a trowel like a sceptre, and an aristocrat who blew up the very definition of what it meant to be a lady in 20th century England. She was the inspiration for one of the greatest characters in literary history, the lover of one of its most brilliant minds, and a force of nature who carved her own world out of the ruins of the old one. This is the spectacular, complicated, and utterly unforgettable story of Vita Sackville-West. To truly understand Vita, you have to understand the world that forged her. Imagine England in the final glittering twilight of the Edwardian era. On the surface, it was a world of supreme confidence and unshakable order. The British Empire, a vast swathe of pink on the world map, was at its zenith. Society, particularly the upper echelons into which Vita was born, was governed by a set of rules as rigid and intricate as a corset. Life was a grand theatrical performance. There was the London season, a dizzying carousel of debutante balls, dinners, and race meetings at Ascot, all designed for one purpose: to present well-bred young women to society and secure them a suitable husband. Then there were the country house weekends, where the political and social elite would gather in magnificent estates for hunting, shooting, and languid afternoons of gossip over tea, a world immortalized in shows like Downton Abbey. It was a world of immense privilege, but also of immense pressure, where appearances were everything, and a single misstep could lead to social ruin. For a woman, her path was clear. She was to be a decorative object, a wife, a mother, and the silent manager of a great house. Her own desires, ambitions, and intellect were, at best, a charming hobby, at worst, a dangerous liability. But beneath this polished, gilded surface, the ground was shaking. The old certainties were beginning to crumble. In the smoky backrooms of London and the industrial heartlands of the North, new ideas were taking root. The suffragettes, once a subject of drawing-room amusement, were becoming a force to be reckoned with, their protests growing more militant, their demands for the vote more insistent. They were chaining themselves to railings, smashing windows, and hunger striking in prison, a shocking affront to the patriarchal order. At the same time, the theories of Sigmund Freud were crossing the channel from Vienna, whispering revolutionary and unsettling ideas about the human mind. The notion that our lives were driven by a dark, swirling subconscious, filled with repressed desires and primal urges, was beginning to challenge the Victorian ideal of stiff upper-lip self-control. It was a world on the precipice of a great cataclysm, the First World War, which would shatter this fragile social order forever, sweeping away an entire generation of young men and the world they were meant to inherit. It was into this simmering cauldron of tradition and rebellion, of opulent certainty and profound anxiety, that Victoria Mary Sackville-West was born on the 9th of March, 1892. And her birthplace was no ordinary home. It was Knole House in Kent, a place that was less a house and more a medieval city, a sprawling, romantic, and utterly overwhelming testament to 400 years of English history. Knole wasn't just built, it had accrued over centuries, a labyrinth of gray stone and mullioned windows. Legend claimed it had 365 rooms, one for every day of the year, 52 staircases for every week, and 7 courtyards for every day of the week. Its galleries were lined with priceless portraits of monarchs and ancestors, its staterooms filled with silver furniture and tapestries that had witnessed the secrets of kings and queens. For the young Vita, Knole was not just a home, it was her universe, her playmate, her first and most enduring love. The scent of wood smoke, old stone, and beeswax was the scent of her childhood. The portraits on the walls were her silent companions. She felt the weight of its history in her very bones. But this magnificent inheritance, the thing that defined her more than anything else, was also to be the source of her deepest heartbreak. Knole was a gilded cage, and from her earliest days Vita was already rattling the bars. The contradictions of Vita's life began with her own bloodline. On one side, she was the pinnacle of the English aristocracy. Her father, Lionel Sackville-West, the third Baron Sackville, was a gentle, dignified, and quintessentially English peer. He was the master of Knole, a man who embodied the traditions and responsibilities of his class. But Vita's mother, Victoria, was another story entirely. She was his first cousin, but her origins were the stuff of scandalous romance novels. Victoria was the illegitimate daughter of the previous Lord Sackville and a flamboyant Spanish dancer named Josefa de la Oliva, nicknamed Pepita. Pepita's story was legendary, a fiery, beautiful performer from Malaga who had captivated the English diplomat and borne him several children out of wedlock. This meant that Vita, the future chatelaine of one of England's grandest houses, had the passionate, untamed blood of a Spanish dancer coursing through her veins. This duality was the central theme of her existence. She was both the insider and the outsider, the aristocrat and the bohemian. She called this her perversity, this internal tug-of-war between her English side, reserved, traditional, deeply attached to the land and its history, and her Spanish side, passionate, melancholic, and rebellious. Her mother, Victoria, was a living embodiment of this conflict. She was a brilliant but deeply eccentric and manipulative woman. Having fought a long and sensational legal battle to prove her own legitimacy and secure her inheritance, she was fiercely protective of her status and obsessed with propriety. Yet she was also prone to wild extravagance, dramatic emotional outbursts, and a certain foreign flamboyance that set her apart from the other staid aristocratic wives. She adored Vita, but also sought to control her, seeing her daughter as both an extension of her own ambition and a rival for attention. Their relationship was a tempestuous cocktail of intense love, fierce rivalry, and profound misunderstanding that would shape Vita's emotional landscape for the rest of her life. Growing up in the vast, echoing solitude of Knole, Vita became a creature of imagination. With no siblings of her own age and parents who were often emotionally distant, she retreated into the world of books and her own burgeoning creativity. She devoured the classics in the cavernous library, losing herself in history, poetry, and epic tales. She began to write at a startlingly young age, filling notebooks with plays, poems, and sprawling historical novels. This wasn't just a pastime. It was a necessity, a way of creating a world where she could be the hero she longed to be. And in this private world, the hero was almost always a boy. From her earliest diaries, it's clear that Vita felt a profound disconnect with the female role prescribed for her. She saw herself as the rightful heir to Knole, the next in the long line of Sackvilles to be its master. She would stride through its grounds, her beloved dogs at her heels, imagining herself as a dashing young nobleman, free to ride, to fight, to love whom he pleased. She loathed the frilly dresses and restrictive etiquette of a girl's life. "It has been a great sorrow to me all my life that I was not born a man," she would later write, a simple but devastatingly honest confession. This wasn't just about wanting male privilege. It was a deeper sense of her own identity being at odds with her physical form. This profound sense of gender fluidity would become a defining characteristic of her life, influencing not only her choice of lovers, but also her very way of being in the world. Her first real taste of the passionate connection she craved came not from a man, but from a woman. Her name was Rosamond Grosvenor, a girl she met when she was a young teenager. Their bond went far beyond a simple schoolgirl crush, developing into a deep infatuation that left a significant mark on her diaries and became her first serious romantic connection with another woman. In the privacy of Knole, they shared a secret world of whispered confessions and affection. For Vita, it was a revelation. It was here she discovered that her deepest emotional responses were stirred not by the boys she was expected to marry, but by the beauty and companionship of her own sex. This relationship, though ultimately ended by the pressures of society, was deeply formative. It taught her the art of secrecy, the thrill of the forbidden, and solidified her understanding of her own complex desires. It set a pattern for the future, a life lived on two levels, the public facade and the private, passionate reality. As she entered her late teens, the inevitable pressures of society began to mount. She was brought out as a debutante, a process she found both absurd and excruciating. She was paraded at balls and dinners, her striking boyish beauty and sharp intellect making her stand out amongst the more conventionally pretty and demure young ladies. Suitors flocked to her, drawn by her title, her inheritance, and her exotic allure. But Vita felt like an actor in a play she hadn't written. She was playing the part of the eligible aristocratic daughter, all the while feeling a profound sense of alienation. She looked at the young men who courted her, the charming guards officers, the wealthy heirs, and felt nothing but a cold indifference. Her heart and her imagination were elsewhere, still lost in her secret world of female love and literary ambition. She yearned for a partner who could understand both sides of her nature, who could meet her not just on the dance floor but in the library. She was looking for a meeting of minds, a companion for her soul. And then in 1910 at a dinner party, she met him. His name was Harold Nicholson. He was a junior diplomat, clever, ambitious, and possessing a quiet charm that was the antithesis of the swaggering aristocrats Vita was used to. He was not conventionally handsome, but he had intelligent eyes and a quick, self-deprecating wit. He was instantly captivated by Vita. She was, he wrote, like a beautiful swift hawk, possessing a statuesque grace and a mind that flashed with fierce intelligence. For her part, Vita was intrigued. Here was a man who didn't just want to talk about horses and shooting. He talked about books, about poetry, about politics, about the world. He saw past the heiress and the debutante and saw the writer, the thinker, slumbering within. Their courtship was largely conducted through letters, and it is in this correspondence that the unique foundation of their future life was laid. They were astonishingly, even recklessly, honest with each other. They recognized a similar nature in one another, a shared preference for their own sex. Harold wrote of his romantic entanglements at Oxford, and Vita, though more guarded, hinted at the true nature of her feelings for Rosamond. They didn't see this as a barrier to marriage. Instead, they saw it as the basis for a different kind of union, one founded on absolute honesty, intellectual companionship, and a deep platonic affection. Harold wrote to her, "You are the only person who knows all about me and who loves me in spite of it." It was a pact, a promise of a safe harbor in a world that would not understand either of them. They believed they could build a life together, a partnership that would provide the stability and social cover for them both to be, in private, their true selves. In October 1913, they were married in the private chapel at Knole. Vita dressed in white satin and cloth of gold, looked the part of the perfect aristocratic bride. Society deemed it a brilliant match. But as they stood at the altar, they were making a vow that was far more complex and radical than anyone in the pews could possibly have imagined. Theirs was to be a marriage of true minds, a union that would be tested by war, scandal, and the passionate affairs of both partners, yet would somehow endure for nearly 50 years, a testament to the strange and powerful love that bound them. The first few years of their marriage were a period of adjustment. They moved into a house in London, and Harold's diplomatic career began to flourish. Vita gave birth to 2 sons, Benedict in 1914 and Nigel in 1917. She loved her children, but motherhood did not come naturally to her. The demands of domesticity, the endless routine of nursery life, felt like a cage. She was plagued by a sense of restlessness, a feeling that her own identity as a writer and an individual was being subsumed by the roles of wife and mother. Harold, for his part, was often away on diplomatic postings, leaving Vita alone for long stretches, rattling around in a life that felt increasingly ill-fitting. The intellectual companionship she had craved was often reduced to letters, and the physical side of their marriage, which had never been its central pillar, dwindled. The stage was set for a dramatic interruption, for Vita's passionate, rebellious nature to reassert itself. She was a dormant volcano, and an eruption was imminent. It would come in the form of a woman from her past, a figure as dramatic and destructive as a summer storm. Her name was Violet Keppel. She and Vita had been inseparable as children, their friendship a whirlwind of shared fantasies and intense childish devotion. They had lost touch, but in the spring of 1918, they met again. Violet was now a dazzlingly beautiful and flamboyant socialite, engaged to be married to a soldier named Dennis Trefusis. But the moment she and Vita reconnected, the old bond flared into something far more dangerous. The childhood friendship transformed overnight into a wild, obsessive, and all-consuming love affair. Violet was everything Harold was not. Where Harold was calm, rational, and understanding, Violet was tempestuous, demanding, and possessive. She saw Vita not as a partner, but as a prize. Her, Julian, the male alter ego Vita had confided in her. Violet detested Vita's conventional life, her husband, her children, her domestic responsibilities. She wanted to possess Vita entirely, to run away with her and live a life of pure, unadulterated passion, free from the constraints of society. And Vita, stifled and restless, was swept away by the sheer force of Violet's desire. The affair was conducted with a reckless abandon that defied belief. They met in secret, wrote letters burning with a desperate, feverish passion, and saw themselves as romantic outlaws, 2 souls against the world. "I am not a person to be civilized and tamed," Vita wrote to Violet. "I am a wild thing in a cage." Violet was offering her a key to that cage, a promise of escape into a world of pure emotion. The affair became Vita's secret life, a vibrant, dangerous reality that made her everyday existence feel pale and meaningless. Harold was aware that Vita was seeing more of Violet, but he had no idea of the intensity of the affair. He trusted Vita, trusted in their pact of honesty. He was about to receive the shock of his life. In November 1918, just as the guns of the Great War fell silent across Europe, Vita and Violet made their first escape. Leaving a note for Harold, Vita adopted her male persona, Julian, often dressing in men's clothing such as military trousers and tunics, and fled with Violet to France. As Julian, Vita finally felt she was living her true life. They checked into hotels as man and wife, walking arm in arm through the streets of Paris, intoxicated by their freedom. For Vita, it was the ultimate act of rebellion, a rejection of everything she was supposed to be, the wife, the mother, the baroness in waiting. It was a thrilling, chaotic, and utterly unsustainable fantasy. Back in London, a bewildered and heartbroken Harold was left to pick up the pieces, trying to shield their family from the burgeoning scandal. The two women were eventually tracked down by their families and persuaded to return, but this was only the first act in a drama that would escalate into a public spectacle, threatening to destroy not just one marriage, but two, and to shatter the carefully constructed world of Vita Sackville-West forever. The return to England was not a triumphant homecoming, but a tense, fragile truce. Vita came back not to a cage, but to a home filled with a quiet, wounded love that was in its own way more binding than any lock and key. Harold Nicholson's reaction was nothing short of extraordinary. There were no recriminations, no furious accusations. Instead, there was a deep, palpable sorrow and a desperate attempt to understand. He saw the turmoil in his wife, the warring factions of her soul that had driven her to such a reckless act. He didn't want to punish her. He wanted to help her heal, and in doing so, heal their marriage. His letters from this period are monuments to patience and a love so profound it defied conventional jealousy. He expressed an understanding that was decades ahead of its time. In his diaries and letters, Harold often analyzed Vita's internal conflict, noting her simultaneous pride in and frustration with her female body. He approached her relationships with an almost clinical insight, theorizing that her love for him was protective and almost maternal, while her passion for Violet was possessive and more paternal in nature. He understood, and in this understanding he offered Vita not forgiveness, which she didn't want, but acceptance, which she desperately needed. Violet's family, however, was not so enlightened. The Capotts were horrified by the scandal. Their primary concern was not Violet's happiness, but the family's reputation. Their solution was swift and brutal. The marriage to Major Dennis Trefusis must go ahead immediately. It was a desperate gambit to impose a veneer of respectability over the chaos, to literally chain Violet to a conventional life. Violet, trapped and despairing, fought against it, but the pressure was immense. The wedding in June 1919 was a piece of grim theater. Vita was forced to attend, a spectator at the sacrifice of her love. She watched as Violet, pale and sullen, went through the motions. Her eyes, Vita recalled, like the eyes of a creature in a trap. The ceremony was a sham, a public lie that both women felt as a physical blow. For Vita, it was a devastating confirmation that the world of passion they had created could not withstand the brute force of societal expectation. But a love like theirs, obsessive and all-consuming, does not simply die because of a wedding certificate. The marriage, as everyone suspected, was a disaster from the start. Violet refused to consummate it, locking her bedroom door against her new husband. And in secret, the affair with Vita reignited, now with the added dangerous thrill of adultery. Their meetings were clandestine, their letters filled with the desperate language of doomed lovers. They were addicted to the drama, to the sense of themselves as tragic heroines in a grand romantic saga. "It is a terrible thing to be entangled in this way," Vita wrote in her diary, "a terrible thing to be chained to two people." She was living a life of dizzying hypocrisy, torn between the calm, steady devotion of Harold and the wild, destructive passion of Violet. She was being pulled apart, and she knew that sooner or later, something would have to break. The breaking point came in February 1920. The deceptions had become too much, the strain of their double lives unbearable. Driven by Violet's relentless pressure and her own deep-seated desire for escape, Vita agreed to a second, and this time, seemingly final elopement. This was no impulsive flight, it was a calculated severing of ties. Vita packed her manuscripts, left her sons in the care of their grandmother, and penned a devastating farewell letter to Harold. "I am going away with Violet," she wrote. "You are the one person in the world who will understand. Do not be angry. Pity me for the mess I have made of our lives." Then she was gone. They fled south, through France, leaving a trail of wreckage in their wake. Their destination was a small villa in Avignon, a place where they believed they could finally build a life together, far from the judging eyes of English society. For a few weeks, it was bliss. They lived in a sun-drenched haze of love and freedom. Vita, once again assuming her masculine persona of Julian, felt a sense of release so profound it was almost painful. They were two artists living for their love and their work, a bohemian fantasy made real. But reality has a nasty habit of intruding on even the most idyllic fantasies. The very qualities that had drawn Vita to Violet, her intensity, her possessiveness, began to feel suffocating in the close quarters of their exile. Violet's love was a jealous, demanding thing, leaving no room for Vita's other self, the self that was a mother, a writer, a solitary soul who needed space to breathe. The ghost of Harold, with his quiet understanding and unconditional support, began to haunt their sunlit paradise. Vita started to feel the profound, aching pull of the life she had abandoned, the deep, tangled roots of her love for her husband and her children. The dream of escape was beginning to sour into a new kind of prison. Meanwhile, back in England, the two abandoned husbands, Harold Nicholson and Dennis Trefusis, formed the most unlikely of alliances. United by their shared predicament, they decided to take matters into their own hands. The husbands did travel to France to find their wives, leading to a dramatic confrontation. According to some popular, though likely embellished anecdotes, their pursuit was as dramatic as a novel, with some tales even suggesting they hired a small airplane for the chase. Regardless of the exact method, they did track the women down, leading to the climactic scene of the entire affair. The confrontation was a storm of tears, accusations, and desperate pleas. After a series of near mishaps and a forced landing, they finally tracked the women to a hotel in Amiens. The confrontation that followed was the climactic scene of the entire drama. The two husbands burst into the hotel room, finding Vita and Violet together. The air crackled with tension, a storm of tears, accusations, and desperate pleas. Dennis, enraged and humiliated, threatened to divorce Violet, a move that would ruin her socially. But it was Harold's quiet, pained dignity that ultimately broke through Vita's defenses. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply spoke of his love, of their sons, of the life they had built together. He presented her with a choice, not between a man and a woman, but between two entirely different ways of being. A life of chaotic, destructive passion with Violet, or a life of deep, enduring, and creative companionship with him. In that hotel room, with the rain lashing against the windows, Vita was forced to confront the truth of her own heart. The wild romance had run its course. The fantasy of Julian, the dashing male lover, had shattered against the hard reality of her responsibilities and her deepest affections. She looked at Harold, at his tired, loving face, and she knew where she belonged. The choice, though agonizing, was clear. She would go home. Her decision was a devastating blow to Violet, who collapsed in a storm of hysterics, accusing Vita of betrayal. The scene was operatic in its intensity, a messy, painful, and ultimately tragic end to their great love affair. As Vita walked out of that hotel room with Harold, she was closing the door on a part of her life, a part of herself. The great escape was over. The journey back to England was quiet and somber. The affair with Violet wasn't severed cleanly. It bled out over several months in a series of anguished letters and one final painful meeting. Violet, desperate and manipulative to the end, even feigned a pregnancy by her husband in a last-ditch attempt to make Vita jealous. But something in Vita had irrevocably shifted. The fever had broken. She had looked into the abyss of a life without Harold and her children, and she had pulled back from the brink. The affair had been a necessary, if brutal, education. It had taught her the limits of passion and the true meaning of love. It had forced her to confront the deepest contradictions of her nature, and in doing so, to finally begin the difficult process of integrating them. The period that followed was one of quiet reconstruction. The foundations of Vita and Harold's marriage had been shaken to the core, but they had not collapsed. Slowly and carefully they began to rebuild, and it was during this time that Vita did something remarkable. To make sense of the chaos, to explain herself to herself as much as to Harold, she sat down and wrote. She poured out the entire story of her life, her childhood, her feelings about her gender, her love for Rosamond, and, in unflinching detail, the entire saga of her affair with Violet. It was a raw, searingly honest manuscript of over 30,000 words, a confession and an apologia. She wrote of her dual nature, the pull between her masculine and feminine selves, the conflict between her desire for wild freedom and her deep need for the stability of home. The two sides of my nature are always in conflict, she confessed. I am torn in two, and I am miserable in either role. She sealed the manuscript in a Gladstone bag, leaving instructions that it was not to be opened until after her death. This document, which her son Nigel would eventually publish in 1973 as the core of his book Portrait of a Marriage, remains one of the most astonishingly frank and psychologically astute accounts of a woman's inner life ever written. It was an act of profound self-analysis, a way of turning the wreckage of her life into literature. The reconciliation with Harold was not a simple return to the way things were. It was the beginning of something new, a partnership forged in fire and tempered by a painful honesty. They had stared into the abyss together and had chosen to pull each other back. Their unconventional pact was reaffirmed, but with a new set of unwritten rules, a deeper awareness of the potential for pain, and a renewed commitment to their shared life. They recognized that their bond, however strange it might seem to the outside world, was the bedrock of their existence. It was from this renewed and deepened partnership that the next and perhaps most creatively fruitful chapter of Vita's life would emerge. She began to channel the tumultuous energy of the past few years into her writing with a new focus and discipline. She published poetry and novels, and her literary reputation began to grow. And as she reestablished herself, she was drawn into the orbit of the Bloomsbury group. Through her deep friendship with Virginia Woolf, Vita became a close associate of this circle of writers and artists, though she was never a central member in the way its founders, Yorkshires, were. In Bloomsbury, she found a tribe of fellow spirits who were not shocked by her past or her nature. In Bloomsbury, she found a tribe of fellow spirits who were not shocked by her past or her nature. It was through this group that she was formally introduced to a writer she had long admired from a distance, a woman whose mind was considered one of the most brilliant of her generation. Her name was Virginia Woolf. Their initial meetings were tentative. Virginia, the high priestess of literary modernism, was initially wary of this grand aristocratic figure. Vita, for her part, was in awe of Virginia's intellect and ethereal, almost fragile, beauty. They were two of the most formidable women in English letters, circling each other with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and a frisson of rivalry. Neither of them could have known that this cautious beginning would blossom into one of the most significant literary and romantic relationships of the 20th century, a love affair that would produce not chaos and scandal, but an immortal masterpiece of literature. The phoenix was about to take flight once more, not into the fire of destructive passion, but towards the clear, bright light of genius. The friendship between Vita Sackville-West and Virginia Woolf began with an almost comical diffidence, like two majestic ships approaching each other carefully in a dense fog. Virginia, already celebrated for her groundbreaking novels like Mrs. Dalloway and Jacob's Room, was initially rather disdainful of Vita's more conventional narrative prose. She saw Vita as a beautiful aristocratic blue stocking, intelligent, yes, but perhaps lacking the radical intellectual edge of the Bloomsbury set. Vita, on the other hand, was utterly captivated by Virginia. She found Virginia's ethereal beauty, her keen intellect, and her mordant wit irresistible. She was drawn to Virginia's vulnerability, a fragility that belied the razor-sharp mind. Vita saw in Virginia a kindred spirit, someone who understood the complexities of the human psyche with a depth that few others possessed. Their initial flirtation was primarily intellectual, conducted through a series of increasingly intimate letters and tentative meetings. Virginia, ever the astute observer, began to find herself fascinated by Vita. She was intrigued by Vita's striking appearance, her height, her somewhat masculine bearing, her dark, gypsy-like beauty. But it was Vita's unconventional life, her deep connection to the ancient lineage of Knole, and her uninhibited passions that truly seized Virginia's imagination. In Vita, Virginia saw a living embodiment of the contradictions and complexities she explored in her own fiction, the interplay of class, gender, history, and desire. Vita, with her casual aristocratic confidence and her wild, untamed spirit, was the antithesis of Virginia's own delicate, intellectual, and often anxious temperament. The attraction was palpable, a magnetic pull between opposites. The true intensity of their relationship began to blossom in 1925. By this time, both women were well-established writers, and their intellectual sparring quickly morphed into a profound emotional and physical intimacy. This was not the chaotic, destructive passion Vita had shared with Violet Trefusis. This was a love affair, characterized by a deep mutual respect, intellectual stimulation, and a gentle tenderness. Virginia, notoriously shy and often wary of physical intimacy, found a surprising comfort and passion in Vita's arms. Vita, for her part, found in Virginia a lover who appreciated her mind as much as her body, someone who understood the complexities of her gender identity without judgment. Their letters from this period are legendary, a testament to the passionate intensity and intellectual brilliance of their connection. Virginia, typically reserved, found herself pouring out her soul to Vita, revealing depths of emotion and desire she rarely expressed. "I'm reduced to a thing that wants Vita," she famously wrote, a stark admission of her profound yearning. Vita, in turn, found herself deeply in love with Virginia, cherishing her intelligence, her wit, and her delicate beauty. They spent weekends together at Vita's country home, Longbarn, and later at Sissinghurst, engaging in long conversations, working on their respective novels, and sharing an intimacy that nourished both their hearts and their minds. For both women, it was a profoundly liberating experience. Virginia, often plagued by bouts of severe depression and a fragile nervous system, found stability and joy in Vita's robust, grounded presence. Vita, who had always sought an almost masculine freedom in her love affairs, found a surprising tenderness and intellectual equality in her relationship with Virginia. Harold Nicholson, Vita's ever-understanding husband, was not merely aware of the affair, he approved of it. This might seem utterly bizarre by conventional standards, but it perfectly illustrates the unique and progressive nature of their marriage. Harold saw Virginia not as a rival, but as an intellectual peer and a source of profound happiness for Vita. He genuinely admired Virginia's genius and saw the positive effect she had on his wife. He even became a good friend to Virginia himself, engaging in lively intellectual discussions with both women. Their triangle was, in its own way, a revolutionary model of enlightened marital understanding, a testament to their shared commitment to individual freedom and a deep, unconditional love that transcended jealousy. The most famous and enduring fruit of Vita and Virginia's love affair was Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando, a biography. Published in 1928, it is a playful, fantastical, and utterly unique literary masterpiece. Conceived as a love letter to Vita, Virginia wanted to write a biography that was not bound by the conventions of history or gender, a book that would allow her to capture the essence of Vita's multifaceted personality across centuries. The novel's protagonist, Orlando, begins as an Elizabethan nobleman who lives for centuries, experiencing different historical eras, eventually changing gender from male to female, and finally arriving in the 20th century as a celebrated writer. The parallels to Vita's own life were unmistakable and deliberate. Orlando's ancestral home, Orlando's house, with its 365 rooms and centuries of history, was a thinly veiled portrait of Knole. Orlando's love for the house, their sense of deep belonging, and their ultimate dispossession mirrored Vita's own painful relationship with her ancestral home. The character's fluid gender identity, moving seamlessly between masculine and feminine guises, was a direct reflection of Vita's own complex relationship with gender. Even specific details, like Orlando's writing a long poem, The Oak Tree, echoed Vita's own poetic ambitions. She was working on her epic poem, The Land, at the time. Orlando was more than just a fictionalized biography. It was a profound act of artistic homage and a radical exploration of identity. Virginia used Vita as a muse, a vessel through which to explore themes of gender, time, history, and the enduring nature of the self. The novel was a daring experiment, shattering traditional narrative structures and redefining the very concept of biography. For Vita, it was an astonishing and deeply moving tribute. To be immortalized by the greatest writer of her age, to have her deepest self understood and transformed into such a vibrant, living character, was an unparalleled experience. It cemented her place not only in Virginia Woolf's heart, but also in literary history. The publication of Orlando made their relationship public in a discreet literary way, and it confirmed that their love was not merely a fleeting affair, but a creative partnership of immense significance. While her relationship with Virginia Woolf was creatively enriching, Vita's life continued to be a tapestry woven with multiple threads of love and friendship. She never entirely abandoned her adventurous spirit, nor her capacity for passionate attachments. Indeed, even during her relationship with Virginia, Vita engaged in other affairs, most notably with Mary Campbell, another aristocratic woman. This might seem contradictory or even callous by modern standards, but for Vita, and within the context of her unique marriage to Harold and the liberal Bloomsbury circles, it was simply part of her multifaceted emotional life. Her heart, it seemed, was large enough to hold many loves, each fulfilling a different aspect of her complex personality. Harold, with his customary understanding, continued to navigate these complexities with a stoic grace, secure in the knowledge that Vita always returned to him, to their shared life, and to the deep, unwavering bond that formed the core of their existence. But Vita was not just a muse or a lover. She was also a prolific and accomplished writer in her own right. She produced a vast body of work, novels, poems, biographies, and essays. Her novel, The Edwardians, published in 1930, became a bestseller. It was a thinly veiled satirical portrayal of the aristocratic world she had grown up in at Knole, offering a critical yet affectionate insider's view of the manners, morals, and hypocrisies of the upper classes. The book was a sensation, partly because of its sharp social commentary and partly because of the widespread speculation about which real-life figures had inspired its characters. With the Edwardians, Vita proved herself to be more than just Virginia Woolf's lover or an aristocratic dilettante. She was a serious and successful literary voice, capable of capturing the complexities of her own world with wit and insight. Her poetry, too, was highly regarded. Her most ambitious poetic work, The Land, an epic poem celebrating the rhythms of rural life and the agricultural year in Kent, won the Hawthornden Prize in 1933, a prestigious literary award. This poem showcased Vita's deep, almost spiritual connection to the English countryside, a theme that would become increasingly central to her life. Her writing style was distinct from Virginia Woolf's modernist experiments. Vita was a more traditional lyrical writer, celebrated for the beauty of her prose and her evocative descriptions of nature. She possessed a gift for storytelling, a knack for narrative that engaged a wider readership than many of her modernist contemporaries. However, despite her literary successes and her remarkable personal freedom, there remained one deep, unhealed wound in Vita's heart: the loss of Knole. Due to the ancient laws of primogeniture, Knole, as an entailed property, could only pass to a male heir. Since Vita had no brothers, the magnificent estate, her birthright, and the emotional anchor of her entire life would pass to her uncle and eventually to a distant male cousin. This was a source of profound sorrow and a sense of lifelong dispossession for Vita. She had always envisioned herself as the next mistress of Knole, carrying on the Sackville legacy. The house was not just bricks and mortar to her, it was a living entity, imbued with the spirits of her ancestors, a symbol of her identity. To be denied it felt like a betrayal, a profound injustice based simply on her gender. This heartbreak, this unfulfilled yearning for Knole, profoundly shaped Vita's later life and her greatest creative achievement. It instilled in her a fierce desire to create her own Knole, her own sanctuary, a place where she could finally establish her roots and build a lasting legacy that was entirely her own. And that opportunity arose in 1930, when she and Harold stumbled upon a derelict, decaying old property in Kent. It was a ruin, a ghost of a castle, but for Vita, it was a blank canvas, a promise of redemption. The property was Sissinghurst Castle. When they first saw it, Sissinghurst was a complete mess, a rambling, neglected Elizabethan mansion, most of its buildings crumbling, its grounds overgrown and choked with weeds, used mainly as a farmyard. But Vita, with her deep historical sense and her powerful imagination, saw past the decay. She saw the ghost of its former glory, the beauty beneath the brambles. For Harold, it was simply a cheap country house they could afford. For Vita, it was destiny. It was a chance to finally put down roots, to pour her immense creativity into something tangible, something that would be hers alone, a legacy that even primogeniture could not take away. And so, Vita and Harold, with their two sons, embarked on the colossal task of transforming a ruin into what would become one of the most famous and influential gardens in the world. This wasn't just gardening. It was an act of profound self-creation, an attempt to build a paradise out of pain, a living, breathing testament to her unique vision. The creation of the garden at Sissinghurst was not merely a project for Vita and Harold, it was a form of salvation. It was a joint act of creation that would become the most enduring and perfect expression of their unique partnership. When they took possession of the property in 1930, it was a scene of romantic dereliction. The magnificent twin-turreted Tudor tower, where Vita would eventually establish her writing sanctuary, stood intact, a proud survivor of centuries. But the rest was a landscape of decay. The former Great Hall was a roofless ruin, the priest's house was crumbling, and the collection of farm buildings was surrounded by a sea of mud, old bedsteads, and rusted farm equipment. It was, as Vita wrote, a place of squalor and loveliness, a sleeping beauty waiting for a kiss. For a woman who had spent her life yearning for a place to call her own, a place she could shape and define, it was an irresistible challenge. From the very beginning, the garden became a perfect metaphor for their marriage. It was a collaboration of two distinct yet complementary temperaments. Harold, the classicist, the diplomat, the man who loved order, symmetry, and logic, took on the role of the architect. He designed the bones of the garden. He laid out the grand axial walks that provide long, breathtaking vistas through the property. He designed the geometric enclosures, the brick walls, and the yew hedges that would divide the space into a series of distinct outdoor rooms. His design was formal, elegant, and imbued with a sense of classical harmony. It was Harold who imposed order on the chaos. Vita, in contrast, was the romantic, the poet, the bohemian. Her role was to provide the flesh for Harold's skeleton. She was in charge of the planting, and she approached it with the passionate, artistic sensibility of a painter. Within Harold's formal geometric enclosures, she unleashed a riot of color, texture, and scent. She famously described her gardening style as cramming, stuffing, planting in every available inch. She had a deep love for old-fashioned, heavily scented roses, letting them scramble up walls and tumble over hedges in a profusion of romantic abandon that was the antithesis of the stiff, formal rose gardens of the time. Her method was one of controlled chaos, of lushness and abundance contained within a classical frame. It was the perfect marriage of his intellect and her passion, his structure and her soul. Together they created a series of enchanting garden rooms, each with its own distinct character and mood, a journey of discovery for anyone who walked through it. The most famous of these is, of course, the White Garden. It remains a masterpiece of horticultural artistry, a symphony in silver, gray, and white. Vita designed it to be at its most magical in the twilight, when the white flowers and silver foliage would seem to glow in the fading light. She planted it with a subtle and sophisticated palette, the pure white of iceberg roses, the ghostly spires of foxgloves, the delicate froth of gypsophila, and the cool elegance of white irises and gladioli. To walk into the White Garden at dusk is to enter an ethereal, dreamlike space, a place of profound peace and otherworldly beauty. In stark contrast was the Cottage Garden, a hot, fiery explosion of color that reflected Vita's passionate Spanish side. Here she crammed together flowers in every shade of red, orange, and yellow, creating a vibrant, sun-drenched tapestry that hummed with the energy of bees and butterflies. It was a place of warmth, joy, and uninhibited exuberance. Then there was the Rose Garden, a celebration of her greatest horticultural love. She eschewed the modern, often scentless, hybrid tea roses in favor of old, historical varieties. Gallicas, damasks, and albas, chosen for their complex, intoxicating fragrances and their soft, romantic colors. It was a garden that appealed as much to the nose as to the eye, a place to be immersed in scent. At the very heart of this creation stood the Tudor Tower. Vita claimed the topmost room as her own private sanctuary, her writing room. It was here, surrounded by thousands of books, her desk positioned to look out over the burgeoning garden, that she felt most truly herself. This tower room was her fortress of solitude, her replacement for the lost kingdom of Knole. From this vantage point, she could survey her creation, a world she had literally brought into being through her own vision and hard work. It was a place of immense psychological significance, a symbol of her hard-won independence and her creative power. Here, she was not a wife, a mother, or a society figure. She was the undisputed queen of her own self-made castle. The Sissinghurst project did more than just create a beautiful garden. It solidified and redefined the bond between Vita and Harold. It gave them a shared, all-consuming passion, a creative enterprise that bound them together in a way that their children and their social lives never quite had. Their letters and diaries from the 1930s are filled with excited discussions of planting schemes and design challenges. It was a conversation that lasted for 30 years. The garden was their joint masterpiece, a living, growing symbol of their enduring and unconventional love. As Sissinghurst grew, so did Vita's public persona as a gardener. In 1946, she began writing a weekly gardening column for the Observer newspaper, which she continued until just before her death. The column, titled In Your Garden, was a phenomenal success. It made her one of the most famous and beloved gardeners in Britain. Her writing was not technical or pretentious. It was witty, opinionated, deeply personal, and infused with her poetic sensibility. She wrote about her triumphs and her failures with equal candor, and her passion was infectious. For thousands of ordinary post-war Britons tending their own small plots of land, Vita's column was a weekly source of inspiration and practical advice. She transformed from the scandalous aristocrat of the 1920s into a cherished national treasure, the wise and witty sage of Sissinghurst. During these years of intense creative focus, the nature of her other great relationships also matured. The passionate, all-consuming affair with Virginia Woolf slowly and without a dramatic rupture transformed into a deep and unwavering friendship. The physical intimacy gave way to an even more profound intellectual and emotional companionship. They remained each other's most trusted confidants and literary critics until the very end. It was a relationship that had evolved beyond the fever of romance into a steady, life-sustaining bond, a testament to the deep love and admiration they shared. Vita had learned, perhaps through the painful lessons of the Violet Trefusis affair, that the most enduring loves were not always the most tempestuous. But the idyllic world they were so painstakingly creating at Sissinghurst was not immune to the storms gathering in the world outside. The 1930s were a decade of mounting anxiety and political crisis. While Vita was planning her rose garden, Adolf Hitler was rising to power in Germany. While Harold was designing vistas, Mussolini was consolidating his fascist regime in Italy. The Great Depression cast a long shadow of poverty and unemployment over Britain, and the Spanish Civil War served as a brutal dress rehearsal for a much larger conflict to come. Vita and Harold were not detached aesthetes, hiding from the world in their floral paradise. They were deeply engaged with the political turmoil of their time. In 1935, Harold was elected to Parliament as a National Labour MP. From the start, he was a staunch and vocal opponent of Hitler and the policy of appeasement being pursued by the Chamberlain government. His diaries from this period provide a chilling, insider's account of the political blindness and wishful thinking that gripped Britain in the years leading up to the war. He and Vita hosted political figures at Sissinghurst, and their letters are filled with a growing sense of dread. They listened to Hitler's speeches on the radio, their alarm mounting at the naked aggression and the brutal persecution of the Jews. This deep-seated opposition to Nazism put them in very real danger. They were both prominent, outspoken anti-fascists, and they knew exactly what would happen to them if Germany successfully invaded Britain. Both of their names appeared in the Sonderfahndungsliste GB, the Special Search List GB, better known as the Black Book. This was a list compiled by the SS of over 2,800 prominent British residents to be immediately arrested upon the invasion of Britain. Faced with the terrifying prospect of capture by the Nazis, Vita and Harold knew they were in grave danger. Some accounts and biographies suggest they even made a grim pact to take their own lives rather than be captured, possibly acquiring a lethal dose of morphine for this purpose, though this detail remains unconfirmed. This was not a melodramatic gesture. It was the sober decision of two people who understood the true nature of the evil they were facing. When war finally broke out in September 1939, it brought this threat to their very doorstep. Kent, with its proximity to the coast of France, became the front line in the Battle of Britain, known as Hellfire Corner. From the tower at Sissinghurst, Vita and Harold could watch the dogfights between Spitfires and Messerschmitts, etching trails of smoke across the summer sky. They listened to the drone of the Luftwaffe bombers heading towards London, and learned to distinguish the sound of German engines from their own. The war stripped away all frivolities. Petrol was rationed, food was scarce, and a strict blackout was enforced. In line with the Dig for Victory campaign, parts of their beautiful manicured lawns were unceremoniously plowed up to plant potatoes and onions. Vita, the grand lady of the manor, fully embraced her wartime duties. She actively participated in the local war effort and the Dig for Victory campaign, which saw parts of their beautiful lawns plowed up to plant potatoes and onions. She also took on the responsibilities of a local fire warden, her nights punctuated by the wail of air raid sirens. The war brought immense hardship and fear, but it also brought a strange sense of purpose and unity. However, in the midst of this national struggle, Vita was to suffer a devastating personal blow. On the 28th of March, 1941, Virginia Woolf, who had been struggling with a severe bout of depression, filled her pockets with stones and walked into the River Ouse near her home in Sussex. Her death by suicide was a profound shock that reverberated through the literary world and left Vita utterly heartbroken. The news reached her at Sissinghurst, and her diary entry for that day is a testament to her grief. "I have not the heart to write," she scrawled. "Virginia's death is a terrific blow. I still can't believe it. I shall miss her all my life." The loss of Virginia was the loss of a soulmate, a mind that had understood her like no other. It was the end of a great friendship, the end of a literary conversation that had enriched her life for nearly 2 decades. The world felt suddenly colder, emptier. As the war raged on around her, and the future of Britain hung in the balance, Vita was left to mourn the loss of one of the brightest lights she had ever known, a personal tragedy that compounded the darkness of the times. The end of the Second World War in 1945 was met not with wild jubilation, but with a deep collective sigh of exhaustion. Britain had survived, but the cost was immense. The nation was bankrupt, its cities scarred by bombing, and its empire beginning to unravel. The glittering, confident Edwardian world that Vita had been born into was now a distant, almost mythical memory. The landslide victory of Clement Attlee's Labour Party in the 1945 general election heralded a new social order. It was the dawn of the welfare state, of high taxation for the rich, and of a determined effort to dismantle the old class structures. For the aristocracy, the writing was on the wall. The age of the grand country house of vast estates run by armies of servants was over. It was a time of austerity, of rationing, and of profound social change. For Vita and Harold, this new gray post-war world required a period of significant adjustment. In the 1945 election, Harold lost his seat in Parliament, bringing his political career to an end. They now faced the daunting practicalities of maintaining a large and demanding estate like Sissinghurst in an era of scarcity. Labor was scarce, money was tight, and the future felt uncertain. They were forced to sell off land and possessions to make ends meet. It was a strange and often frustrating new reality for two people who had grown up surrounded by privilege. Yet, in many ways, they adapted with a characteristic aristocratic stoicism. Their focus narrowed, centering more and more on the private world they had created together within the walls of Sissinghurst. Vita's public life also found a new, more settled rhythm. While she continued to write novels and biographies, it was her weekly gardening column for The Observer that truly defined her post-war persona. In an era when many Britons were turning to their gardens and allotments for solace and sustenance, Vita's voice became a source of great comfort and inspiration. She wrote with a unique blend of practical expertise and poetic sensibility, sharing her deep love for the soil and the seasons with a nationwide audience. She became, in a sense, the nation's head gardener, a figure of earthy wisdom and continuity in a world that had been turned upside down. The scandalous rebel of the 1920s had mellowed into a cherished national institution. The later years of Vita and Harold's marriage were a long, peaceful autumn after the storms of their youth and middle age. The passionate dramas, the clandestine affairs, and the emotional turmoil had subsided, replaced by a deep, comfortable, and unwavering companionship. Their life at Sissinghurst settled into a gentle, productive routine that was the envy of their friends. They occupied separate parts of the castle, Vita in her beloved tower, Harold in the south cottage. They would work on their respective writing projects throughout the day, often communicating by little notes, and then meet for meals and in the evenings. It was their sacred ritual to read their day's work aloud to one another, offering gentle criticism and encouragement. Their love, which had once been a radical pact of freedom, had matured into a partnership of profound mutual dependence and affection. Their letters to each other, which they continued to write even when living under the same roof, are a touching record of this final chapter. The passionate declarations of their youth are replaced by a shorthand of shared jokes, concerns about the weather, and endless loving discussions about the garden. "My darling, I do love you so," Harold wrote to her in a typical note. "Even after all these years, it is nice to be so fond." It was a quiet, undemonstrative, yet deeply felt love, the bedrock upon which they had built their extraordinary lives. In 1953, Harold was awarded a knighthood for his services to literature and diplomacy. He was now Sir Harold Nicholson. Vita, in a characteristic move that underscored her independent identity, continued to write and publish exclusively under the name Vita Sackville-West, the name she had established for herself. Even after her husband was knighted, her public and literary persona remained firmly her own. It was a small gesture, but a powerful assertion of the autonomy she had guarded so fiercely all her life. Harold, of course, understood perfectly. As they entered their late 60s, the inevitable frailties of age began to catch up with them. They were both plagued by arthritis, and the physical work of the garden became more difficult. Their world shrank, but their contentment deepened. They found their greatest joy in the simple shared pleasure of the world they had created. A new rose in bloom, the success of a planting scheme, a quiet evening by the fire. These were the things that now brought them the most happiness. In the late autumn of 1961, Vita began to suffer from severe abdominal pains. After a series of tests, the diagnosis was confirmed: inoperable pancreatic cancer. She faced the news with a remarkable lack of self-pity, with the same stoic courage she had displayed throughout her life. She was determined to spend her final months at Sissinghurst, the place she loved more than any other on earth. Harold's diary from this period is one of the most moving and heartbreaking records of love and loss ever written. He nursed her with a desperate, tender devotion, his own world collapsing as he watched the love of his life slowly fade. He recorded every detail of her decline, his entries a raw testament to his overwhelming grief and his profound sense of impending loneliness. "I have no future without her," he wrote, the simple words conveying a universe of pain. He read to her for hours, held her hand, and tried to shield her from pain, all the while knowing that he was losing the anchor of his existence. "Oh, my darling," he wrote on the night before she died. "I just don't know how I shall be able to live without you." Vita Sackville-West died on the 2nd of June, 1962, in her bedroom at Sissinghurst, with Harold by her side. She was 70 years old. Her death was the end of a great adventure, the final curtain on a life lived with an astonishing fullness and a defiant courage. Harold was utterly bereft, a man adrift. He survived her by 6 years, dedicating his final years to editing their letters and preserving her memory. He died in 1968 and was buried beside her in the family crypt at the local church, their extraordinary partnership finally united in death. So as the dust settles, what is the lasting significance of this remarkable woman? Why does her story continue to fascinate and resonate with us today? Her legacy is a rich and multifaceted one. There is, of course, the tangible living legacy of Sissinghurst. Bequeathed to the National Trust, her garden has become one of the most visited and influential gardens in the world, a timeless masterpiece that continues to inspire millions with its beauty and its unique blend of formal structure and romantic planting. It is a living, breathing work of art, her most enduring poem. Then there is her literary legacy. As a writer, she was a significant voice of her time, a best-selling novelist and an award-winning poet who captured the nuances of her class and her deep love for the English countryside. And as a muse, she is immortal. In the pages of Virginia Woolf's Orlando, she lives on forever, a timeless, gender-fluid, and utterly captivating spirit, a testament to a love affair that transcended convention and produced a work of genius. But perhaps Vita's most profound and relevant legacy lies in the way she lived her life. Long before it was fashionable or even conceivable for most, she lived a life that challenged every convention about gender, sexuality, and marriage. Her struggles with her own identity, her sense of being a man trapped in a woman's body, and her unapologetic love for both men and women prefigured the conversations about gender fluidity and bisexuality that we are only now beginning to have openly. Her marriage to Harold was a radical experiment in love and partnership, a testament to the idea that the most profound bonds are not always the most conventional ones. It would be a mistake, of course, to see her simply as a faultless heroine. She was a complex, often difficult woman prone to snobbery and selfishness. And we cannot ignore the immense privilege that enabled her to live the life she did. Her aristocratic status gave her a freedom and a safety net that was denied to almost all other women of her time. But it is this very complexity that makes her so compelling. She was not a saint. She was a flawed, contradictory, and deeply human being who wrestled with her own demons and desires on a grand stage. In the end, we are left with two powerful images that seem to capture her dual nature, the swan and the phoenix. The elegant, graceful writer, the swan, who could create sentences of lyrical beauty, and the fiery, passionate, and resilient woman, the phoenix, who lived a life of constant reinvention, rising again and again from the ashes of scandal, heartbreak, and loss. Her life was a testament to the courage it takes to be true to oneself, to embrace all of one's contradictions, and to create a world of one's own making. It is a story about the search for love, the search for a home, and the search for an identity in a world that tries to force us into boxes. And that is a story that will never lose its power.